And again, I'm Lynette Pryor-Lowe, and I'm a graduate student in the College Student Development and Administration program. The only thing I have left is to finish this thesis, and I am ready to go. Yay. I would like to first of all thank Dr. Nick as chair, serving as my chair, stepping up after Dr. Taylor moved to St. Louis. And I'd like to thank Dr. Taylor for beginning the process with me, because there were a number of issues as we first started this research, and he helped me immensely to get this research off the ground. I'd also like to thank Barbara Stewart, who was there from the very beginning with me in helping me figure out what this research was going to look like. And then Beth Hartung, who was an absolute expert and friend and mentor in every way possible in this process. And even though, according to Hmong culture, I'm not supposed to use any public or demonstrate any public affection, I think that I need to recognize my loved one, my partner, for if it wasn't for you, B, I know that I wouldn't be standing here today. So I thank you. So, the abstract, which all of you should have. I conducted a qualitative study, and my purpose was to investigate how knowledge and perception of white privilege on the part of leaders affect campus climate at a predominantly white institution. The questions that guided me initially as I developed this research were fivefold. The first one, does a lack of understanding and recognition of unearned white privilege, whoops, I have to keep you on task. Does a lack of understanding and recognition of unearned white privilege lead to a lack of desire to create an equitable, diverse campus atmosphere? The second question, how aware are administrators of white privilege? The next two questions were extremely important to me because I think that uncovering privilege is only the first step, and then we need to take action. So question number 3, how does this awareness affect their interactions with people who do not share this unearned privilege? Question number 4, how can white privilege be uncovered so that we can reduce its effects? And quoting Dr. Peggy McIntosh, who is a leader in the area of white privilege study, she states, having described white privilege, what will I do to lessen or end it? The last research question, and I'm not keeping up with you, sorry. Is white privilege really a big deal? Do individuals with privilege consider the topic to be important? I apologize, but to get you to the outcomes as quickly as possible, for time's sake, I'm going to just read the next 2 slides. The role of leaders in higher education is an important place in beginning to understand how an awareness, or lack thereof, of white privilege impacts the educational experiences offered at a predominantly white college campus. This qualitative survey examined the viewpoints of leaders at a predominantly white institution regarding their own perceptions of race and white privilege in order to gain a better understanding of how these factors impact their leadership. The sample description. I used critical case sampling that was described or developed by Patton in 1990 to understand college administrators, since they were the specific target group that I wanted to look at. So, invitations were sent to randomly selected representatives from the top 2 tiers of administration at a predominantly white institution. I ended up with 10 total participants. Tier 1 were upper-level administrators, including all the way from the chancellor, provost, associate chancellors, all of those, all the way to including deans and associate deans. Tier 2 were the academic department chairs and student development division directors. And there were 5 participants from each of those tiers. My original intent, which I'm glad didn't work out the way that I wanted it to, was I only wanted white administrators to participate in the study. So I sent invitations only to white administrators, and there was a lack of response. Even with some significant follow-up, repeated email requests, as well as a phone call conversation with their offices, and sometimes with them. When I had the lack of response, I worked with my faculty advisor, and we decided to, and my committee, and we decided to widen the sample and invite administrators of color. And surprise, surprise, there was a sufficient response, and we moved forward. And I have the smiley face because I'm really, really happy that that second invitation went out, because the research is so much richer as a result of administrators of color responding. Just to tell you what my sample was like, I'm not going to tell you according to tiers, but overall there were 10 total participants, and there were 3 white females, 4 male persons of color, and 3 white males. And I don't know about you, but all of the predominantly white institutions that I have ever been part of, the upper level administrators are pretty, there are more males than females, and there are more whites than persons of color. And yet, as you can see, there were only 3 white males who responded. And even more significant than that, perhaps, is from Tier 1, the upper level administrators, there were no white males who responded. And I think that's indicative of the hesitancy that a lot of people have to discuss these issues. And we'll discuss that in a little while as well. The survey instrument that I used, I entitled Uncovering White Privilege Survey. And it was something that I developed. Developed it over approximately a 2-year period. I used a pilot study, as well as solicited feedback from leaders in the study of white privilege to improve the questions and get them to the point where they were able to get at the information that I wanted to get at. It is a 25-question survey. The questions were open-ended, and the guidelines for question development were outlined by Patton in 1990. So, telling you a little bit about that. The question development, all of the types of questions that I used experience/behavior questions, opinion value questions, knowledge questions, feeling questions, but I did not include any background or demographic questions. And that was on the recommendation of the IRB, as well as some other areas, some other considerations, I guess I should say. One more. The research design. I originally wanted to have oral interviews so that I could really have a conversation between myself as researcher and the participants, so that I could follow up and really get an understanding of the true meaning of what the participants were responding to. However, the Institutional Review Board had some concerns about protecting the anonymity of the administrators that were participating or choosing not to participate in the study. So after some negotiation with the IRB, we decided upon a confidential online survey that the administrators could respond to anonymously. And then also, I was able to use the Uncovering White Privilege survey that I had developed. One interesting interaction that I just would like to mention about the interaction with the IRB was, because of my last name, I was assumed to be Asian. And there was a true hesitancy on the part of the Institutional Review Board to allow a non-white researcher to investigate areas of privilege. A number of things were said to me, as well as to my faculty advisor, about an assumed bias, a hidden agenda, a number of those types of things. Once individuals realized that I was a white person, the conversations really changed. And I think that that is indicative of the fact that I am operating with extreme privilege. And I don't know that the research would have gone forward had I not been a white researcher. My study limitations. There were a number of limitations for the study. I've listed 4. The subjects for this study were limited. It was limited to a small number of upper-level administrators at a medium-sized, Midwestern, predominantly white institution. This limitation restricts generalizing the results to other institutions that may differ based on populations, demographics, and geographic locations. Limitation number 2, the participants in the study were volunteers. The fact that they were willing to participate may indicate a level of awareness or knowledge of unearned privilege that may not be present in the wider population. Limitation number 3, the topic of this study is sensitive, especially in a society where whites do not like to discuss racial issues. The majority of leaders invited to participate were white, and persons in leadership positions are often sheltered or shelter themselves from discussing issues that may make them feel vulnerable. This feeling of vulnerability likely prevented some white leaders from participating in the study. And the last limitation that I list is the survey was administered through an online provider. This required participants to type out answers to questions, and I'm guessing that it led to more cursory answers instead of the depth of analysis that may have been available in a face-to-face interview. No opportunity for follow-up questions, all of those kinds of things. So, my data analysis procedure. I used the constant comparative method developed by Glasser and Strauss in '67 and then supplemented by Lincoln and Guba in 1985. The main goal of my research was to understand campus leaders' awareness of white privilege from their own words, and then process the data with a minimum of interpretation, describing what I learned from the participants' words themselves. So, the data analysis procedure. For the future researchers in this room, perhaps you're the most important people to me in the room, I'd just like to demystify my data analysis process, because I think that when you look at qualitative research, it seemed to me to be overwhelming and just so confusing. And I really thank Beth for her assistance in helping me figure that data analysis process out. The first step in my process of data analysis was just to become very familiar with the data. And I never exaggerate. After reading the material 1,000,000 times, I sorted each answer by race and gender, just to get a feeling of whether race and gender impacted the responses that individuals were giving. When I felt that I had a good feel for the participants' words, I identified chunks of meaning, and technically you call that unitizing the data. Then I had the highly technical process of cutting and pasting those unitized pieces of data onto note cards so that I could sort and handle the large amount of data that was available. Then I proceeded with the discovery process, searching for recurring words, themes, phrases, and topics to see what patterns were coming from the data. Then I wrote these recurring words and phrases onto initial discovery sheets. And those were just big pieces of paper on the wall. I think I ended up with 6 or 8 discovery sheets. And they were just packed with words that kept coming up through the responses. From those initial discovery sheets, I started determining provisional categories. I wrote the provisional categories on a long sheet of blank butcher paper, and I sorted each data card into the provisional categories and developed new categories as I needed to. Once all the cards were separated into their provisional categories, and I'm looking at the wall, thinking about my room downstairs in Wilder Hall, I compared them to determine if they fit together. And then I started pulling out the properties and characteristics that defined the category in order to distill the meaning that was there. From that, I developed a rule of inclusion for each category, and that was just a propositional statement to convey the meaning that was held in each set of cards. The rule for inclusion were phrases like, I'm finding out that administrators think, believe, experience, value, identify, etc. The final step in that data analysis process was to review the categories for overlap and ambiguity. This process resulted in 16 outcome propositions, which were easily categorized under 5 main headings. And now, for what you've all come to hear, we'll talk about the outcomes. The outcome categories. It ended up that there were 16 outcome propositions with 5 main headings. The first section discusses administrators' thoughts on their personal racial identity. Section 2 discusses administrators' thoughts about racial inequity. Section 3 explores their words about white privilege itself. Section 4 discusses the link between white privilege and the administrator's power, position, and responsibility. Section 5 is the final section and discusses why administrators believe an awareness of white privilege is important. Okay, before I start discussing each outcome in depth, I list the first 3 questions of the online survey just to give you a flavor of what types of questions the administrators were asked to respond to. Number 1, please describe your first experience with race. Number 2, we often look at our students of color based on their racial identity development. How often do you think about your racial identity? And number 3, what are your thoughts about your racial identity? The full survey instrument is on the poster presentation at the back of the room, so you can check out the rest of the questions. The outcomes from category 1. The first category examined racial identity, and it included 2 outcomes. The first was the first identified experience with race, and then second, the administrator's own racial identity process. Okay, the first experience with race. There was quite a distinct difference between the responses of whites and persons of color throughout the survey, throughout the questions. However, in this area, it was particularly distinct. For whites, their first identified experience with race, and the reason I say identified experience with race is because we live in a racialized society where our experiences with race start at birth or even before birth. But a lot of times we don't recognize those experiences of race. And for whites, their first recognized experience was later in life. A lot of individuals talking about high school experiences, college experiences, and most of them were either positive or neutral. There's always exceptions. There was one white individual who spoke of a more multicultural youth experience, both from the experiences of her father bringing students home, multicultural as well as international students home, to have dinner and different mentoring activities. And she also spoke about having a multiracial church experience, faith-based experience. But for all of the other individuals, it was later and a positive or at least neutral experience. For example, one of the individuals spoke about having a summer position, working in an agricultural setting, and he worked alongside a Native American individual, and it was just a neutral statement. That was his first experience. Another individual spoke about coming to campus and living in the residence halls. And there was an African-American student that lived on his cube. And the statement that was made was, there was some interaction, but not a lot. So a pretty neutral experience. The other side was there were people who talked about their first experience with race in a very positive way. One of the white females who spoke about her experience was she came to campus and she was able to take a multicultural literature class and how excited she was to be able to talk about race for the first time. So they were all later high school, college, and either positive or neutral experiences. And I think that that's significant because a lot of personal identity development happens as a young person. For persons of color, the experiences were very different. The experiences identified were very early in life, and they were very negative experiences, often talking about directly experienced racism. There was one exception as well, and that was an individual who was born outside of the United States. And as an adult coming to the United States, he said that was his first experience with race because in his country of origin, race was not really an issue. There were lots of examples that that stood out. One that particularly impacted me was the recounting of an experience of a young person in a church setting, in a Sunday school setting. And a white mother grabbed her child and said, "Don't play with that Jap kid." And I think about the impact on the person who was telling that story and the messages being sent to that person who was telling the story, as well as the impact of the white child who was being grabbed, and how damaging, those experiences were. Other individuals talked about church bombings, in fact, common church bombings, the constant negative images in the media, stories and warnings from parents on things to do and not to do. So the experiences were distinctly different. Then, sorry, I missed that. The outcomes from category 1, the second category, were their own racial identity process. And again, persons of color identified the fact that their personal racial identity development was considered critical or crucial. One administrator indicated that situational factors, and I thought that was an interesting way of talking, that situational factors often remind him that he is a person of color. And because race continues to be such an issue in our community and in our nation, he needs to be aware of racial identity as for himself as well as as he parents his child growing up in this environment. A quote, "Racial identity is an important part of who I am. In fact, it is a defining feature of my overall identity. Having a positive racial identity is critical to my mental health." On the other hand, whites, most of the white administrators really didn't deem racial identity development as important. Most administrators indicated that they rarely or almost never think about their racial identity. A quote, "Being white means that I am not aware of the issues of race unless I choose to be." Others indicated that they only think about race when they are in relation to someone who is non-white. One person indicated a biracial relationship. A few others talked about when they're working with a colleague of color, they think about race, but otherwise they don't. Category number 2 is racial identity, and it included the acknowledgement of white privilege, the importance placed on the historical perspective in the United States, and American myths that perpetuate systems of privilege. So, the acknowledgement of white privilege. All of the administrators acknowledge that racial problems and issues exist both on their campus and in the broader national experience. The depth of that understanding varied greatly depending on the degree of privilege or oppression that they had experienced in their lives. As I reviewed the responses, I envisioned a pyramid. It was split not only along racial lines, with persons of color forming the base with the greatest depth of knowledge of inequities and the reasons behind these inequities, but also along gender lines, with white females forming the middle level of the pyramid, being more open to seeing the possibility that systems of privilege lead to inequity. These levels of understanding are predictable and reasonable. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. White males capped off the pyramid with limited but still acknowledged depth of understanding, and I think that that is significant. These levels of understanding are predictable and reasonable. Through personal experiences with racism, persons of color have a deep and intimate understanding of systems of privilege. And this is a quote that stood out in my mind. "In my personal and professional life, I see racial disturbances, hatred, and prejudice all the time. It is so obvious, in some ways, very sad. The looks, stares, and the key area of trying to put this educated black person in his place. I love it when I have someone wanting to see my ID or making assumptions based solely on my race. The best one is, you don't talk or act like them. It cracks me up, but it is also to the point of being really upset with these ignorant comments." For whites, these personal experiences with blatant discrimination are far less likely to occur, and knowledge is often, at best, secondhand in nature. Category number 2, outcome number 2, is the importance placed on historical perspective. For administrators indicated that systems of racism and privilege have a very deep history in the U.S. In fact, 8 of the 10 administrators identified the historical context of the United States as being important to the discussion of race today. One administrator wrote, "Since the founding of this country, white privilege has existed. It is so much a part of the fabric of American society that many people don't even see it." Another quote, and this was particularly profound. "Look, for example, at the Naturalization Act of 1790, which established the criteria for U.S. citizenship. You had to be free white to be an American citizen. Labor unions then incorporated that principle into their membership criteria and thus went the escalator for white privilege." Another administrator observed, "There has always been racial problems in this country. However, the manifestation of racism has changed over time. Today, we see more subtle and abstract forms of racism. We continue to see differences between racial groups in the economy, home ownership, educational attainment, and incarceration rates." And I think that's interesting that a white person gave that quote, because later on you'll see another very contrasting white perspective. The American myths that perpetuate systems of privilege. The participants demonstrated a recognition that U.S. culture and tradition teaches concepts like meritocracy, the American dream, the Protestant work ethic, hard work equals success, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, etc. These core, quote, American ideals or beliefs, while having a seed of truth, are largely myths that are used to ignore inequity and justify the systems of inequity and privilege. Quote, "The biggest issue here is that Americans want to believe that the playing field is level and that anyone who is willing to work hard can be successful. So we don't need affirmative action anymore. I spend time during my classes showing how meritocracy is a myth and explaining why people get hired and what determines who gets promoted and how merit has little to do with it. This makes some students uncomfortable, but not to deal with it is to engage in the denial of the reality of discrimination in this society." Administrators also pointed to how the belief in hard work always equals success leads many whites to be able to deny systems of privilege that would be otherwise very obvious to them. Category 3 explores white privilege itself, including feelings about privilege, their personal definitions of privilege, terms that need to be further explored, and a category that I have entitled, "I know white privilege leads to inequity, but..." Feelings about privilege. Oh, I better move on. Feelings about privilege. One of the main things that I've learned in the 7-year process of developing and conducting this research, and again, I never exaggerate, is that the discussion of white privilege brings up many emotions. This emotional charge often hinders people from engaging in these important conversations. Most of the emotional responses of whites are negative and defensive. A few of the emotions expressed by white participants included guilt, suspicion, distrust, apathy, inadequacy, fear, avoidance, frustration, discomfort, and sadness. 2 quotes. "People are willing to discuss oppression, but not the oppressor. Talking about groups who are underprivileged is easier than talking about who the overprivileged are, because now those in the majority have to talk about themselves and the possible role they play and the benefits they receive from the way our society is currently structured." Another white administrator commented on the fact that although conversations about unearned privilege are difficult to engage in, these discussions are vital to open doors to true progress. Quote, "The biggest pitfall is the combination of naivete and apathy. Too many white people don't see the problems of oppression and privilege and don't want to learn about them, often seeing it as threatening instead of opening them up to a wider and more complex, but ultimately more satisfying world." That was a white person who said that. The responses from persons of color seem to cover a wider spectrum of emotion, from very hopeful because the conversations have begun, to very frustrated and aggravated because the conversations have only just begun. One administrator stated, "I think the most aggravating thing is when people who are the beneficiaries of white privilege want to deny it." Personal definitions of privilege. On a more cognitive level, administrators demonstrate that they recognize and understand that white privilege creates a system that inevitably produces inequity, is founded in U.S. history, is the hallmark of institutional racism, and is easily ignored by whites because so much of it happens at an automatic, subconscious, and hidden level. Some recognize this inequity in everyday experiences, while others acknowledge that they need help to recognize privilege, but they understand that historic and current data from housing, employment, education, and the justice system all indicate that privilege exists. When asked if white privilege contributes to racial inequity, all the respondents agreed that it does. Only one respondent qualified his response by saying, in some cases, yes. The other 9 respondents emphatically agreed that white privilege contributes to racial inequity. A quote, "Of course, because it means that white people get to yes in situations where people of color are blocked from such positive results. And that shows up in data on who is hired and promoted, who is jailed and for how long, who gets to live where and what schools they get to attend, and so on." Another quote, "There is research data to suggest that white privilege is real. Some studies have found that in situations where job candidates are equally qualified, a white candidate is more likely to receive the job offer. In the criminal justice system, a black individual is more likely to receive a longer sentence than a white individual for committing the same crime." And I promise there's not a tornado going on. The last quote, "We continue to see differences between racial groups in economy, home ownership, educational attainment, and incarceration rates." Terms that need to be further explored. The joys of an online survey instrument. There were a number of statements or phrases that seemed to belie a deeper meaning, but because there were no definitions of terms given or explanations not included in their written responses, the fullness of the research was not fulfilled. There are some words and phrases that I didn't understand. I don't know what their true meaning was, and their words are obfuscated. Just a few of them, just to mention. One person talked about the racism of accommodation. And I think I understand a little bit about what they were talking about, but I would really like to sit down and talk with that person about what they meant when they talked about the racism of accommodation. Numerous people talked about the race card, and that carries so many meanings for so many people. And then one that I really didn't understand was the pros and cons of victimology. I didn't know exactly what was going on there. Sometimes I think when we're uncomfortable discussing a subject, we use words that are open to interpretation and leave them there. We're not really willing to put our straight opinions on the line, but we put words out there that you identify what it means. So there are a number of terms that need to be further explored. And the last category in this section I entitled, "I know white privilege leads to inequity, but..." A couple of white participants made statements and used terms that seemed to signal a reluctance to acknowledge the racial experiences of persons of color, the importance of race in our society, and/or the full connection between privilege and oppression. One administrator signaled a significant distrust and inability to take the word and guidance of colleagues of color unless they had proven themselves to be objective. "I made a decision," this is a quote, "and followed a policy that irritated a colleague of color. In an attempt not to appear racist, I reversed the decision, only later to learn that I had fallen prey to the race card. This has made me very cautious. I only seek consultation from colleagues and supervisors of color who have proven their ability to be objective." Another individual wrote, "Race is an issue that gets used a lot. It is used in multiple ways, to get what people want, to make people feel guilty and uninformed. Upon reflection, these administrators will recognize that they have had bad experiences with other white colleagues without feeling that they had fallen prey to the white race card. But because of current racial experiences on their campus, they were unable to see beyond the race of their colleagues of color." This small number of participants also expressed a lack of evidence that would convince them that white privilege is real. And there are 4 quotes here. "I don't think privilege has a lot to do with outward benefits. I don't see any overt educational, monetary, or career benefits of being white. There's not much evidence that white privilege is real on campus. I would like to hear about examples of privilege that are based on race." A third quote, I'm aware that my colleagues of color often express issues related to racial problems. At the same time, it's hard for me to see any overt signs of racism. And the last one, I think, was from a very honest place. White privilege is difficult to deal with because when it is implemented, I get something from it. I just see that as fair. I can't assume, unless I see or hear of similar situations, that it is white privilege. I guess I just shut my eyes sometimes. Outcome category 4. Section 4 discusses the link between white privilege and the administrator's power, position, and responsibility. This section identifies commitment levels, empowerment issues, the importance placed on education, and a stated desire to change. Commitment levels. Administrators stated that their commitment to level the playing field on campus is and needs to continue to be personal, active, and evolving. Those were 3 areas that they indicated were important in their commitment levels. They also state that their commitment to equity and social justice is crucial in their leadership roles. And many also recognized the need for continued growth on a personal level. And I think I have 4 quotes here. I think it is the most crucial commitment that an administrator can make. If we can't make strides on these issues in higher education, then what hope do we really have as a society? Another quote. As an administrator, it is crucial that I understand the issues facing the faculty, staff, and students, and that I play an active role in resolving these issues. It's equally important that I continue to grow on a personal level. And there's a contrasting quotes here, a contrasting word choice between an administrator of color and a white administrator, which I think indicates, and this happened a number of times, indicates a difference, a very subtle difference, but a definite difference. The first quote is from an individual of color. I encourage participation from my staff, holding my staff directly accountable through performance appraisals. And a white administrator said, I encourage others to become involved. One thing that I have started to learn about fighting systems of privilege and oppression is that one of the privileges of being white is that I can decide when to fight and when to stop. Persons of color do not have the option of stopping out for a while to take a rest and come back recharged. Their commitment is always there. This sentiment was expressed poignantly by one administrator of color. Quote, white privilege is a constant irritant in my daily life, and I have to deal with it. Empowerment issues. A number of administrators recognize that their leadership roles give them the power to affect change. And that's really hopeful. We have leaders who feel empowered to actually make a difference on campus. And I'm glad that they felt that way on their campus. Sadly, one white female administrator did not feel that she had much power as a faculty member to make a difference. And this is her quote. I have always believed in leveling the playing field. However, as a faculty member, I did not feel empowered to do things that made a difference. And I think one of the lessons to be learned here at UWL in thinking about this issue is we are currently looking at growth and access. And if we want growth and access to work, we need to empower the people at ground levels to make a significant impact in improving equity. I think that was a big issue here on campus with Plan 2008. There was no individual ownership. And I think that that's really important to make sure that people at the ground level are empowered. The stated desire to change. Almost all administrators that participated expressed the benefits of a more diverse and equitable campus and society. The benefits of diversity are enormous. The opportunity to learn and grow from interacting with people who have a completely different experience with life than you've had. The opportunity to become a more complex thinker, to see multiple perspectives, to understand that truth is multifaceted, which means to have a better understanding of reality. The benefits of diversity on campus include all this and more. Another quote, diversity is a true win-win situation. We need to increase the diversity on our campus for the benefit of all, capital A-L-L, students, faculty, and staff. Another quote, "The world is a diverse one, and unless we have created an equally diverse campus atmosphere for the students to learn from, we have not provided the education that they need to become responsible world citizens." Administrators also expressed their desire for change. One person wrote, "Now that I realize that privilege exists, I am uncomfortable with its existence. I wish we could level the playing field." Another person said, "How do we remove it? I believe it is wrong for any race to have a privilege while other racial groups do not share the same benefits." And another person wrote, "It's gone on far too long." Two administrators pointed out the depth of what needs to happen in order to truly improve equity on campus. One person stated, "We can't be satisfied with just recruiting a diverse group of students to campus." The second person said, "The major challenge for diversity on a college campus is to create a campus climate that is welcoming of diversity." And this is profound. "This requires an examination of all practices, procedures, and policies that might privilege one group over others." And category 5, the final category. It discusses why awareness of white privilege is important. Many respondents believe that an awareness of white privilege and the subsequent action based on that knowledge are key steps to ending systems of oppression. One person wrote, "I am confident that if we are truly to have discussions about overprivilege, that we can really start the discussion about equity and fairness." Another person said, "For most people, just becoming aware of what white privilege is would go a long way in changing people's thinking about race and equity." A white administrator commented on the fact that although conversations about unearned privilege are difficult to engage in, these discussions are vital to open the doors to true progress. "The biggest pitfall is the combination of naivete and apathy. Too many white people don't see the problems of oppression and privilege, and they don't want to learn more about them. They often see it as threatening, instead of opening them up to a wider and more complex, but ultimately more satisfying world." Recommendations for future research. And I've left this blank because I think that the area of research into white privilege is wide open, and lots more needs to be done. And the only thing that limits is the number of people who are interested and willing to delve into future research. Implications for practice. My title is Uncovering White Privilege. How does it affect campus leaders? Did this research answer the questions contained in my title? I'm encouraged to think that the answers given by administrators shed light on how white privilege affects campus leadership and provides guidance for future practice. White administrators need to choose to be aware of race if they hope to increase faculty, staff, and student diversity and provide for an equitable experience on campus. Administrators also need to be able to look for guidance from people who have expertise in many areas. They do that already. They don't know everything. Understanding systems of privilege is an area where whites need to trust the guidance of people who best understand these systems. Now, I'm not saying that we need to rely on persons of color to do all the work associated with creating an equitable campus. That's as far from my viewpoint as possible. However, if we don't trust the knowledge base of persons of color, we as whites are just learning, just beginning to get an understanding, and we need to trust that knowledge base. Numerous campus leaders believe that uncovering white privilege could be key to addressing oppression and inequity in society and on their campus. They would like to see discussions, training sessions, and curriculum infusion to help faculty, staff, and students more fully understand their role in systems of privilege and oppression. And I think that that speaks volumes for implications for future practice. And the last thing that I put up are just some resources that I made available to the participants before they responded to the survey, but also resources that are wonderful if you are interested in learning more about white privilege. And that is the end, and I open the floor to questions. I don't, and that's the thing, I did a pilot study with a number of individuals first, and I weeded out a number of questions at that point. So I think the 25 questions that I ended up with, even after I got the responses back, I felt pretty good about the information that I received. But the oral interviews, I think, is crucial. If this research happens again, I think that the oral interview process is really going to be important, because there were so many things that we needed to follow up on. If we could have asked, additional questions, I think that it would have been deeper research. So, but I think the questions, check them out and give me feedback. But I think that the questions served the purpose that they were going for. Mm-hmm.
What were some of the reasons given by the administrators you followed up with, asking them to participate, and they said no? What were the reasons they gave?
Let's see. One, I don't know if I should start with this, but one of the top level administrators, I wasn't really even able to get to that person. They were protected by secretaries and program assistants. And the response that I got back from that person, that gatekeeper, I guess, was, no, this person doesn't respond to surveys like this. Other individuals, when I actually spoke with them, a number of people said, "Oh, I'm so busy. It's just going to take me so much time." And even though I assured them, my pilot study, one of the things that they did was they time to see how long it took them to participate. And I have no idea how long it took the actual participants to participate. But for the pilot study folks, I think it was anywhere from 25 minutes to 40 minutes maybe. So it wasn't, and also the online survey allowed individuals to start the survey and come back. There was a glitch at first, but that was available to them. So it wasn't the time-intensive thing that I think, was used as an excuse, perhaps. But so.
Lynette,
Yes.
Didn't they use the excuse for packing the Waukesha?
Yeah. There's a tornado drill in my building. Dr. Parker?
Some of the phrasing you're describing is eerily and disturbingly reminiscent of testimony we heard in 1982 when we undertook the investigation of racial discrimination here at the university. And, I'd like to say we've come a long way, but some of that phrasing is pretty scary.
Yeah, I would agree.
I wanted to know if there's going to be some follow-up with the IRB committee, because that is not their job to judge the validity of the study. That's the job of your advisors.
It was really interesting going through the process with the IRB, and I've actually had a number of conversations with the chair of the IRB since I conducted the study. But the interactions it was very interesting. Dr. Taylor was my chair at the time that I was going through that process, and well, it took, I think it was 3 months after I had submitted my finalized IRB. It was 3 months before I got permission to do the study. I had to completely revamp my institutional review board proposal and resubmit.
Your job is to protect the subjects, so I understand the
Exactly.
confidentiality
Yep.
issue.
Yep.
The thing that you flagged was that they thought you were a student of color.
Exactly.
And then they were questioning
Exactly.
the validity of the research
Exactly.
and the research process, and that is not
Yeah.
their job.
Exactly. And we've had a number of those conversations since. Dr. Taylor was invited down for a 10-minute discussion with the IRB, and he was in the meeting for over an hour, just discussing different issues. And actually, it was interesting. I was not present. I was not invited to that meeting. But Dr. Taylor said to me, they were just saying some things, and finally he said, "Well, Lynette's white, right?" And they said, "Oh," and he said it was just, it was a different conversation.
In some
it was just a different conversation. And the same thing happened to me on the phone. I said, well, I'm white. What you know? And I mean that brings up a whole whole different yeah.
Well, there's a conversation that needs to
Yeah.
continue, and so us faculty in the room, let's continue to have that conversation.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Were any of the, particularly white administrators, able to identify that they were in some way impacted by white privilege themselves? Or did they, and the second part of the question, were they able to identify issues of privilege outside of race?
Yeah, I think that was one of the reasons that in the pyramid discussion, I think that white women, talked about that. It talked about issues of experiencing privilege and oppression, male privilege and female oppression, and I think that was, that's one of the reasons that their depth of understanding was, they were open to hear it a little bit more, or open to think about it. And yeah, I think that we're whited, and yeah, they did talk about experiences that one just kind of popping right out of my head is one of the white administrators said, I have a white son who has just gone to college, and the questions that he is asked when he goes to look in an apartment are totally different from the questions that are asked of his African American friend. And she was able to say, I see this, I see it in my son's life. I see it, in my own life. So yeah, they were able. Some were able to identify.
Did you get any white male administrators too?
See, that's the thing. I had three. I had no white males from Tier 1, but there were 3 white males from Tier 2 who participated, and they had really, really interesting and profound things to say throughout at different times, and there was extremely different range of understanding. So, Thomas.
Yeah, right now on our campus, I think there's a number of instructors that include discussion about white privilege or part of that as part of their lesson plans.
Exactly.
And so on. What do you think would be the effect on our campus if there was a class or we would move more in that direction where all of our students would get at least some of this?
Yeah.
You know.
I guess the reason that I wanted to do this research was I always felt that racism is just this terrible thing that I wish I could do something about it. Understanding white privilege makes you go, wow, I'm the problem. I'm part of the problem. So how do I figure out how to adjust my behavior, how to change all of the things that I'm thinking and doing to become part of the solution. So I think that a class on how we all fit into systems of privilege and oppression would be very, very important. Yes.
Hi, Lynette.
Hi.
Nice job.
Oh,
And I
thank
think
you.
It's an important topic that you're
Thanks.
covering, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I don't think anybody else has seen this type of behavior, but often administrators learn to be cautious in some of the words that they use.
Mhm.
And I think that might have been one of the reasons why
Exactly.
you wanted to do the interview
Exactly.
versus the survey kind of activity. But do you find the responses that there was a guardedness?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, there were, one of the responses at the end, and I don't know if this gets directly to your comment, but one administrator who was an administrator of color said, I wish this had been an oral interview because I would have liked to have spent more time talking about this. And one of the white administrators said, this survey was just way too long. And I think that definitely there was that. There were times, is there anything else you want to add? No, I'm done. This is over. But yeah, definitely, I think that you could see that in length of answers, all of those kinds of things, brevity, all of that. So. Yes.
going through all this and studying a medium-sized Midwestern university.
Predominantly
that's
white.
Predominantly white. That
Great
there's
school.
Hope in actually changing the culture and the privilege of a university like, say, UW-La Crosse, for example, and its deep-seated privilege. I mean, is there really hope to ever see real change, or are we always going to maintain kind of the white cultural constructs?
I think that Tim Wise speaks to this, that I'll always opt for hope because and continue to do the work, because I don't know whether or not it will ever affect true change, but I know for sure that if we aren't working, that it won't ever change. And yeah, I guess like my husband with the weather, I'm sometimes an eternal optimist. And I believe that the reason that I wanted to do this research and not some others, because the IRB, one of the things that was suggested to me was, well, why don't you do it with students? Why don't you poll the EFN class? And it was like, well, that doesn't really get to the leadership positions on a campus that I think is really takes the institution in the direction that it should or should not go. So I think that, with the guidance from leadership, I think that, I hope that, I hope that it does change.
I have a follow-up.
Yes, of course.
Since, I guess, kind of a big question.
Yes.
For me, to you is, and this is less about your research, but about all the time and yourself that you put into all this work on this campus. What do you see that leadership as being? How do you see that leadership taking place? What do you see, a leader or the leadership on campus doing to make a campus a better place?
Well, I think I talked just briefly about it in the presentation about. I think one of the failures of Plan 2008 was it was never expressed to me from leadership that I should have in my personal goals goals that are in line with Plan 2008. My evaluation, my yearly evaluation, should be dependent on whether or not I'm making progress on Plan 2008 goals. And yet, I don't think that people on campus would express that Plan 2008 goals were even really in their mind. And so I think that upper-level administrators have to, like the administrator said, I not only encourage my direct subordinates to participate, I hold them accountable in their performance appraisals. I hold them, and it's not a forcing them to go, it's saying, hey, this is important. We recognize what it is that we value. And if our administrators aren't telling us, this is something that I value and this is something that I expect you to do, then I don't know that we will ever move forward. So, yes?
One thing I'm really concerned about growth and access is that I'm not sure, just administrators, but I'm not sure all of us are really prepared for it.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that our average family income is about $82,000 a year at UPL, even a lot of our students of color come from more privileged backgrounds. And I'm really concerned about that, because if you look at the data, if you know and understand that a lot of the people that we're looking towards recruiting here are people who are, just statistically are going to bring other things to the school, whether it's been their single parents or they're from, the families have experienced trauma or medical emergencies. Maybe they don't have parents at all. I think there's a huge transformation that has to take place before we're ready to really deal with that. Because we have really moved ourselves into a corner where we have high expectations of our students, but the reality is that we're going to bring this population in. And I just don't know if you have any comments on that.
I guess I think of, it's all back to the administrator's words. The administrator who said, we have to look at every policy, procedure, everything on this campus. It's not enough to bring individuals to campus. We have to look at every piece of the puzzle that privileges one group or one group of students over another. And I think that's, I mean, you're absolutely right. It is going to be an intensive process of looking at that and figuring out, well, I mean, the equity scorecard, what are we doing as an institution that creates this inequity? I think that so often in the past, UWL has said, well, this is a problem that students have. No, this is a problem. What are we doing as an institution that prevents equity from being there? So, examining, every nook and cranny, I think, is going to be important if we really want to be successful and move forward, especially with growth and access. But all the way around. Anybody else? Yes.
You had a lot of questions that asked about the leaders themselves. I didn't read all of your questions, but were there some that examined the relationship between the leaders and those in which they lead, as in like the influence of their awareness of privileges, for example?
I'm trying to think back to my survey as well. I think that I'd have to look back again to see. That's a very good question. I think that they spoke to a number of those things, talking about their relationship with their the people that work with them and work for them, and talking about the relationship that they have with students as well. A number of administrators talked about mentoring relationships and the importance of getting to know students as they come in, getting to know new faculty and staff. So there were definitely some responses along those lines. But that's something that I should probably look at again.
Right, because I see with a lot of individuals, they are aware of things, but aren't aware of their ability to make a change or influence somebody else.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
something I'd be
Exactly.
interested in.
Exactly. Do research.
Are you planning on, I know it's next week, are you planning on presenting this research?
I didn't know where I would be in relation to the conference, but it's definitely something that I would like to bring to the White Privilege Conference in future years.
Maybe we have it here.
That's right, exactly. So, anything else? Wow, you guys let me off easy.
You give Lynette another.
Thank you very much. And thank all of you for coming and spending an hour with us. That was really great of you. Yay.